All right, welcome to Peeling Syd Barrett. This will be episode 12. And in this episode, I'd like to cover two songs. So we'll go through Matilda Mother and then POW R TOC H. Now, POW R TOC H it's an instrumental song, so there's not a whole lot to it, really. And I figured I'd just throw it in here with this one. This is normally a time where we kind of call out any noticed improvements or corrections to be made. And let's get to it because there's a few. So the first one I'd like to call out is that Paisley mentioned that the picture of the Siam cat with Mr. Barrett that's part of the regular Pink Floyd version of the video for Lucifer Sam is photoshopped in there. And I guess that kind of makes sense because I had never seen that cat in any of the photos that I have in the material that I have, so it kind of threw me off, but that would explain it. So if that's true, then that makes me think even more that the Siam cat reference is about a person. Now, one more thing I'd like to kind of talk about from Lucifer Sam. There's actually a few of them. Another correction to be made is that I kind of mentioned that it's possible that Mr. Barrett might be actually talking about himself here. And as I thought about it over the last few days, I came to the realization that Sam is, of course, it begins with an S, and so does Syd, both three letters. So he may actually be referring to himself there in a way. He may have given himself a nickname as Lucifer Sam. The whole left side, right side, if you are, I don't know how common this is in England, but I know in Shakespeare, villains and bastard children, boys, are left-handed, and that's a villainous thing. So I'm assuming if something's on the left side that it's evil or wrong, I guess. I don't know what kind of adjective to use there. But right-handedness is considered to be on the up and up, and left-handedness is considered to be kind of underhanded. I'm assuming that's because dealing with left-handed people is difficult in certain situations, especially if you're fighting. It can be viewed as non-orthodox. So if you're like melee combat fighting, it can be very strange to fight someone left-handed. The Huscarls were kind of famous for fighting left-handed with heavy axes. They actually trained that way. And which attacked the sword arm with a heavy axe. And in order to deal with that, then a person would have to turn their entire body with a shield. If you're fighting with a weapon and a shield, it makes it really difficult to deal with someone who's fighting with a two-handed axe and left-handed. I don't know if that's all tied together. I'm just pointing out that left-handedness kind of has a history of being considered to be unorthodox. So another thing that people have kind of mentioned is that Mr. Barrett had tried to become part of Sant Mat, which is a form of like meditation. I guess you could say it's a form of religion. Uses yoga. You can see a lot of pictures of him performing yoga, and it has ties to and a lot of influences with Sikhism, Sufism, Hinduism. It deals with karma and reincarnation. But basically the idea is that you are to go internal and find a trace of internal light or godhood, and then commune with the greater God. And in order to do that, you are supposed to kind of listen to your inner sound or your inner light, and then it's a very personal experience. They do have things that you're supposed to do if you are part of their group. And I'll give a link that kind of explains the basics of the Sant Mat, I don't know, faith, I guess you would call it. But basically they have certain things that you're not supposed to do. So you're not supposed to be violent. You're supposed to tell the truth. You're supposed to maintain a form of chastity. You're supposed to show love and respect for all of humanity, and you're supposed to live a vegan lifestyle. And this would help explain what, if you're familiar with Syd, and people talk about how he put on weight, and he was telling the guys for the "Wish You Were Here" thing that he had a refrigerator full of pork chops. You can kind of understand if he was following or if he was adhering to these beliefs, that would in a way be him saying that he was no longer adhering to that in a roundabout way, instead of just coming out and saying it. So perhaps he was still following kind of a shaman spiritual path on the side, on his own. Perhaps he had his own separate group of people that he was working through that with. It makes me a little bit nervous because I don't know about things in England, but in the U.S. there's a lot of very strange religions, and so and sub-religions, and so people often kind of get caught up in, I guess you could call them almost like cults of personality, or cults really. And I mean, even very intelligent people get caught up in this, and I mean, they have problems with that. Just recently, that strange sex cult got busted for basically manipulating all those young ladies. So it is not, I won't say it's a common thing, but it certainly does happen, and it happens to a lot of very smart people. They get kind of pulled into it. So it's hard really to know what all is going on religiously or spiritually with Mr. Barrett. Of course, Jim Morrison also kind of went through this, and in many ways I would say Jim Morrison is very similar to Syd Barrett in what it appears that he was trying to do. Although Jim Morrison was a little bit more outspoken, and he discussed these things based on kind of these types of songs and some of the actions that we have photos and people talking about with Syd. It does kind of appear that he was trying to figure things out spiritually on his own. Where that took him, it's really hard to know. But if things did kind of go poorly with that, and as we relayed in the previous episode, it could have happened, then he may have been a little bit paranoid from a bad experience that was tied with that. Who knows if that's what's going on, but I would say that I've seen people get very paranoid about those types of things. So it's definitely a possibility. In my mind, it's a possibility. So let's go ahead and get to the two songs, Matilda Mother and POW R TOC H. Now for Matilda Mother, I'm going to do the original version. I'll link that, and then I'm going to link the actual version as it was released. And basically what happened was, of course, copyright, as we've discussed. There was copyright violation with Hilaire Belloc and his estate, and they wouldn't give permission to use the lyrics that were originally put together for the song because they were very, very similar to his poem. And so Syd had to rewrite the lyrics. And looking at those two sets of lyrics, I'm impressed really with how much more interesting Syd's lyrics are than Mr. Belloc's. So in a way, I think it's better that he redid them, but maybe he was... It's an odd thing to try and use someone else's work, because in many ways, doing it your own way is not only more rewarding, but also it's better. But in some ways, you're trying to kind of give homage to something that you really care about with someone that you liked. And when it's copyrighted like that, it's hard to do that artistically. So it's just kind of a sad situation with copyright. So anyway, go ahead and take a listen to those three links: the original version of Matilda Mother, the actual released version, and then POW R TOC H, and then we'll come back and talk about them. Okay, so hopefully you got a chance to listen to the Matilda Mother song. I'm not going to talk too much about the music. It has a descending chord progression. It's pretty basic, so there's not a whole lot going on with the music, but the lyrics are definitely very interesting, and again, the very spooky kind of sound. So the original song takes almost directly from H. Belloc's selected cautionary verses, and one of the poems is called Jim. You can look that up if you like, but basically there's a boy, he's named Jim, friends are good to him, there's tea, cakes, and ham that they give him, and slices of ham, and that's all in the song, almost verbatim. And the interesting thing about this poem is that as it goes on, Jim isn't really listening to his nurse or his parents. He's just going to the zoo and kind of messing around. And what happens is a lion eats him, except for his head. And it ends with Jim not doing as he was told, his father, who is self-controlled, and his mother saying that it doesn't give her any surprise that he wouldn't do what he was told. So that reminds me a lot of his family, and that his father being self-controlled. Apparently his father was very self-controlled. So anyway, the lion bit reminds me of The Boy and the Lion poem, or a painting that we already discussed, and you can see it right there in that poem by Belloc. Perhaps that's a reference or a reason why he would use that. I'm really not certain. So let's take a look at the actual lyrics as they're used by Pink Floyd when they released it. And the Syd version changes. Now he talks about a king ruling a land. There's another royal reference right there. And then he talks about the silver eyes of a scarlet eagle showering silver. And basically there's a mention of illumination, a mention of him being left in the air, in an infant air, which I've tried to understand, but I still can't really get. And then he talks about reading the lines that are black, but they shine. Now that's interesting. That's two references to illumination. So there's showering silver, and then there's the shining black and everything shining, which can be a reference to illumination. The next interesting thing is, to me anyway, is that he mentions that 1,000 of these misty riders are climbing. Now, what they're climbing isn't really clear, but the idea that you're identifying someone as misty and they're climbing makes me think of a mountain. And the Misty Mountains are, of course, part of Tolkien's universe, and very commonly referred to in Led Zeppelin's later music. And then there's a reference to spending a lot of time in a room with doll's house and darkness and perfume, and fairy stories and clouds of sunlight, and then Mother, Tell Me More, which is, I guess, possibly a reference to his childhood. I don't know if he was left in an infant air, I don't know, like some kind of swing, and he didn't really like it. I will say that it's interesting to me that I've talked with a lot of people over time about what their earliest recollections are of childhood, and it surprised me, frankly, the variety in ages. So for someone like me, I really have trouble remembering things that were earlier than, say, 3 years old or so. But I've known people that swear they could remember things from when they were like 1 year old. Actively, mentally, perhaps they're already recording things. I don't know why that happens. I do kind of wonder if the experience of being born is more traumatic for some people. Perhaps I've heard it described in some special. It was talking about the possible trauma that happens with a child being circumcised when they're very young. I don't know if that's true or not, but I certainly don't have very good memory of being very young. At any rate, perhaps Mr. Barrett was active mentally very, very early. I'll relay one of the stories that his sister relays about him being very rambunctious until he could hold a pen or a pencil, and then he was okay after that, so long as he could express himself on paper. And that's in that old link that I sent with the interviews. Now, she relays that with a lot of conviction, but I will point out that she's his younger sister, so she wouldn't have direct knowledge of that. That's something that she probably would have heard from her own parents, which of course still makes it very likely that he was a very rambunctious kid, but she wouldn't actually know that directly. She would simply be relaying a story. So one of the things that I want to convey is that we've discussed many, many literary influences on Mr. Barrett's lyrics. And I would like to point out that, yes, he's quoting from something that's very simple here, but that's for a reason, and that's to relay something from his childhood, very likely. And so to just throw off his lyrics as being overly simple and not delving into anything complicated is to ignore, or perhaps to display, some ignorance about what he's actually trying to do with his lyrics. It's easy to see for a lot of people that this is from Belloc, but to understand that like See Emily Play is actually referencing Shakespeare, many, many people would never pick up on that. Now, there is another bit about string, and that's from a poem called King Henry, I believe. King Henry by Mr. Belloc too. So when he references eating bits of string, that's also from Mr. Belloc. I don't want to get into too much of what Mr. Belloc's specific two different poems could mean, but that's basically what I wanted to relay there. Now, let's get into a few things that are kind of contextual elements. Oh, first let's go ahead and discuss POW R TOC H. So first off, I just want to point out that this is an instrumental, and that he's basically beatboxing at the beginning of the song, which is really cool. It's the first instance I can find of someone beatboxing. Now the TOC H supposedly is, in the title, is a reference for a military club for officers and enlisted men in the English Army. Let me see. And after, it was called the Talbot House, so the TH, a club for officers and enlisted men. I don't know if that's for all the British Army or the English Army, I don't know. But it eventually evolves in time into a Christian fellowship that was organized to serve the community. So there we have ideas of egalitarianism again, and specified through the military. I would like to also point out that POW R TOC H looks like power touch, and if you're at all religious oriented, you'll recognize that the idea of a power touch is I don't know what all religions have that idea, but of course that's something that was attributed to Jesus Christ. So again, that could be another religious reference. I don't know where the power part comes from that. Now, for some context, I want to relay a few things, and hopefully this won't take too long. The first thing that I would like to relay is an individual named J. Krishnamurti, or J.D. Krishnamurti, and he is I guess you could call him almost like a religious philosopher from India. He has a book called The First and Last Freedom, and he was kind of groomed to become a religious leader, and he turned away from it. I don't want to. I don't really like to talk about these things because I don't consider myself to be an expert on them. But if you're interested in the ideas of some of the Eastern philosophies and religions, then I'll suggest possibly checking this out. And I'll relay, I suppose, one reason why I think this might be important, and that is because Mr. Aldous Huxley actually writes the foreword for this, and we already have a reference to Mr. Huxley in one of Syd Barrett's songs. And so it appears that Mr. Barrett obviously is very, very well read, which used to be much more common than it is now. So he very likely was somewhat familiar with Mr. Krishnamurti's thoughts. So if you're interested in that, perhaps that's something that you would like to check out. I'll show the information for that in the description. Now, I want to discuss someone that could be very, very important to the entirety of this development within Mr. Barrett, assuming that there actually was a development within Mr. Barrett that was tied to some form of Eastern philosophy / religion, and that would be a man named Alan Watts. Now, he was sort of a Zen expert, and he did very, very extensive radio talk shows about the concept of Zen and Eastern philosophy and religion. And I just want to point out two books now. One is called The Way of Zen by Alan Watts, and the other one is called Nature, Man, and Woman. And these are both kind of early books, early on in his career, I guess. So let's look at something really quickly in The Way of Zen by Alan Watts. And it's on page 5. Now this is, let me give you some information about the book. The Way of Zen, it's a vintage book. See if I can find a copyright. A vintage book, Division of Random House in New York, and copyright is in 57. So on page 5 here, one of the things that he discusses is the need to educate children how to live in a society, and that one of the things you do is you code them, or you provide them with an understanding of the world as it is appropriate to the parents or to the culture so that they can fit in. Now the problem with that is that quite often a person might pick up the bad habits, only the bad habits or misunderstandings of people that aren't really what I guess you could consider to be overly enlightened. So for example, if you are a part of a society that believes that death is bad and not simply part of a cycle, then you can teach your children to be very afraid of death. And they will carry that fear with them for the entirety of their lives. It can, in fact, steal the happiness from their life because they are viewing death as something bad. Obviously, it's undesirable for most people, but to feel that it is something beyond the scope of what is natural is, in a way, unnatural. Now, I don't know how he goes through and describes these things, but it is it's pretty profound, a lot of the ideas he presents, and I'll suggest checking him out if you haven't. I will link a video from him. It basically discusses the one question that needs to be asked. There is someone named Wiara, W-I-A-R-A, and they have put together a whole bunch of Alan Watts discussions, and they have pretty cool backgrounds. So I will link Wiara's video on Alan Watts that has one of his talks, and if you are so inclined, you can go ahead and check it out. Now, as we mentioned before on a lane, we know that Mr. Barrett had some interest in Zen and Japanese culture. He was wearing a happy coat. So that's an interesting thing, and it somewhat explains why someone would want to go back and psychologically regress, because of the idea, possibly, that they need to relearn things in order to be able to live a full life. And in order to do that, you have to unlearn things that maybe weren't appropriate. Here's another bit, and this is from Nature, Man and Woman, page 113, from the Tao Te Ching. He who knows the masculine and yet keeps to the feminine will become a channel drawing all the world towards it. Being a channel for the world, he will not be severed from the eternal virtue, and then he can return again to the state of infancy. The state of infancy being in many ways superior. So the idea that you have to combine male and female is stated there on that page. And of course, if someone is overcompensating, attempting to be overly male, you have to wonder kind of what's going on in their head, and it can blind them to other aspects of their life. So now this is just general statements, of course, but for example, and it used to be much worse, it's getting better in my opinion, but the idea that men shouldn't show emotion used to be a very big thing. But and it could cause trouble, because if you were a man, let's say you're a man and you really loved a woman or someone, you really loved someone, but you weren't able to tell them, you could lose someone forever that you really deeply cared about, simply because you were afraid to show weakness, what was considered to be weakness, which is admitting emotion. And that could hamper the development of yourself and the development of your life in a positive way. In a way, now they use the term toxic masculinity, I guess, but I'm discussing the idea of being overly masculine actually hindering the development of a man. And that can also go the other way. It can be applied to women that are attempting to be overly feminine, or whatever people, however they want to apply that idea. The idea that people are trying to develop a wholeness within them that ties together both masculine and feminine traits. So for example, if you have let's say you have a sister or something like that, and she's overly meek, which is a stereotype, I realize, but it does happen, and she goes through life without ever trying to do the things that she really wants to do, because for some reason she believes that being feminine means being meek and quiet and timid. That can have a drastically negative impact on her life, and some people are fine with that. That's actually what they want. But for other people that are trying to live a life a different way, and they have an idea of what they want to do, but for some reason they're holding themselves back, or other people are holding them back, that can be a very negative experience. At any rate, the point is, to become whole, it allows people in many ways to develop emotionally and spiritually, to enjoy a more fulfilling life. So perhaps Mr. Barrett was going through all this process, perhaps that's what he was trying to delve into. The idea of regression is contained here within Matilda Mother. The idea of illumination and internal conflict is captured within the song Lucifer Sam. This is all very strange in a lot of ways to me, because I never would have considered those two songs to be about spiritual or religious development. Perhaps they're not. Perhaps I'm totally misreading this, but I do see angles of that in these songs now, and I didn't recognize it before. In a way, it's more rewarding now to hear those songs and consider those things. So let's leave off with one last thing. Now, before I mentioned the film Life of Brian and how the noses, the fake noses, big nose joke, right? It's one of the jokes in the very beginning of Life of Brian. Wearing beards, that's also in Life of Brian. In fact, wearing beards with sexual inversion, in other words, women wearing beards so that they can go to stonings. Both of those things were in the video for Arnold Layne. There is another sexual inversion joke within Life of Brian about gestation. There's the Latin joke. And then now we also have the possibility of a mistaken Messiah, which is kind of delivered also in Life of Brian. So anyway, it's interesting to me that all those things kind of are in that movie as well. One more correction, I suppose, or addition, is consideration of a photo of Mr. Barrett with, I believe, Miss Corner. And I'm just going to show a portion of it, which is of the butterfly in the background. So we already discussed the song Butterfly and what some of the meanings of it could be. This photo is very interesting to me because Mr. Barrett is posing in front of this specific piece. It looks like either a form of cloth artwork that's been stitched together somehow, or I'm not exactly sure how it's put together, but based on how he's sitting close to this piece of artwork and how it's centered in the photograph, it does kind of make you think that they're deliberately showing it. It may have been some form of a inspiration for the song Butterfly, or perhaps it was just interesting to him. Perhaps it's a mass-produced piece of just like furniture or decoration for a house. I don't know. I'm not overly familiar with it, but I know that Mr. Barrett worked in a lot of different media, and he did use cloth in some of his multimedia works of art. So I do kind of wonder if perhaps he might have made that, which would make it a piece of artwork by him. And I will point out that he was kind of driven to make pieces of art for songs that he was making. We'll see a little bit more of that as we move on. At any rate, that's all for now. So I'll talk to you folks later.